Okay, welcome along, everyone. I'm Colin. I'm a trainer with software education. Craig is one of my colleagues, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what has changed since the last time he did this talk. This is Craig. He's the global agility lead at SoftDead and supervisors, product manager, I guess, for our course suite. Keep an eye on what state the courses are in and so forth. And he is going to be talking about 40 different agile methods. And to give him the most chance to talk about it, I might hand it over to him now. Thank you very much, Craig.
Thank you, Colin. Welcome, everybody. I see few people I know in the audience, so good to see you. For those I know, for those who don't, welcome. Yeah, the talk's called 40 Agile Methods in 40 Minutes. I may relax that just a little bit. It can be done in 40 minutes, but in order to take a breath, maybe I'll do it in 42 or something like that. But I think, firstly, the first question that often gets asked for this particular talk is why. There's so many good things in our community, and particularly at this time where people are starting to question, perhaps agility a little bit and the value. The reality is that just one framework is not necessarily going to solve your problems. And so the reason I actually created this was that I gave this at a Scrum gathering meeting. I want to say back in around about 2015, the original version of this. And it was really just to say to people, hey, if you're doing something like Scrum, there's 39 other things. So whatever it is that your primary method is, there are some other things out there. Now, this is going to go really fast. So don't bother trying to take screenshots or things like that. We'll give you the slides at the end of the talk. We'll send you back out a link. So just sit back and sort of see the flow. The other thing is this is not meant to go very deep. I want you just to be aware of some of these things out there. There's plenty of details on the slides as we go through that'll also give you information for further research if you wish to go look at it. But really just to make you aware. So one of the things that happened is when I gave this talk originally, Lynn Kazali, who's a well-known visual designer and just all-round good person in our community, was in the audience, and she drew this diagram, and some of you may have seen this because it tends to pop up. Steve Denning, for example, uses it in Forbes quite a bit. So this sort of went a little bit viral after the talk. So what happened was that when I updated this talk, I got Lynn to develop us a new version of it. So this is the new version. Many of the same things, if you have seen it before, there are some things that are the same, but everything's been updated for as it states. I updated just a couple of weeks ago, so everything's ready to go. So everybody got the skates on. Hopefully everybody's ready to go. Let's start the clock and let's do 40 Agile methods in 40 minutes. So let's just get started with some of the foundational methods. It doesn't even get a number because everything that we talk about today is based on the Agile Manifesto. We're all aware of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, written in 2001, 17 folks who were all just doing things in the 90s and early 2000s, got together for a conference, the Lightweight Methods Conference, and out of that came this, which even by their own admission, they didn't know that it was going to take off as well as it did, but it did. So everything that we talk about here builds upon that. So I mentioned Scrum as being one of our foundational methods. It is still to date the most popular method in use at 63%. That number's quite high because it's not necessarily just Scrum, but lots of other methods utilize Scrum at their heart. And so if you're doing anything like daily stand-up, daily Scrum, sprint planning, working in sprints or iterations, then you're using something based around Scrum because it is the basis of most of the iterative processes. It dates back to 1996, although you can take the date back even earlier if you actually go back to the article in Harvard Business Review called "The New Product Game," which is where this came from. Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber came together, and the Scrum Guide continues to be updated. It was updated just a couple of years ago with the most latest version. One of the things, I guess, is that there's been a bit of a fracturing around this in more recent years. Ken and Jeff have gone their separate ways. There are a number of different organizations that can accredit you in Scrum. It's really about the process. There's no technical process practices or role-based things talked about in there. It is very small team focused. The one thing that does happen outside of Scrum is something called Scrum But. We're a Scrum But, not that sort of but, but the word but is when you hear yourself doing things, saying something like, we're doing Scrum, but our sprints are 12 weeks long. And Ken Schwaber and Eric Gunnison wrote some articles, well over 10 years ago, so saying that, hey, when you're doing Scrum, you need to evolve to Scrum and Scrum and is when you start to see things that are evolving past Scrum. So we're using Scrum and we're also doing some scaling, or we're doing Scrum and we're evolving to different techniques. So even that's one of the things I guess behind this talk is some of these things can be ands. You can use the base, but sometimes out of the box or by the book, things don't work as expected. So the other thing we have is XP or extreme programming, not that XP, but this XP, although interestingly, they both released in the same year, which was 1996. Kent Beck with this brilliant book called Extreme Programming Explained. Back when I started my Agile journey back in the early 2000s, this was pretty much the only book I had. But what you'll notice if you look at the process at the top is that the extreme programming process is very similar to the Scrum process, just with different names. There's still a planning loop. There's still iterations. So if you use the word iteration, probably balanced on somebody who comes from an extreme programming background. It talks more about the technical techniques like acceptance tests, and still at the end of an iteration, the idea is still to get a small release out at the end of it. What I really like is a diagram on the right-hand side that says that, that shows you that all these practices actually, rely on each other. And so if you've ever tried to implement something like pair programming or, even things like, refactoring, without some of the other things, they don't work terribly well. So it talks a lot about the technical practices. The reality is, though, that this as a process in its own right, it died out a lot because these just became good software engineering practice, and a lot of the things in extreme programming evolved to things like DevOps, which we'll talk about later. Like Scrum, it's got a small team focus, but it does add the code element. Still relevant, even though it's coming up to 30 years old. Crystal, or Crystal Clear, as many people know it as. This is Alistair Coburn's approach. A lot of the things that sometimes we hear in Agile training or in training in general come from Crystal Clear, just words that we sometimes take for granted. Things like if you hear people use terms like cross-functional teams, for example, Crystal brought those things to the world. Even starting to think about automated testing and things like that. Whilst extreme programming talked about that, these were made a little more relevant in Crystal Clear. Whilst the book was written on Crystal Clear, it was actually meant to be a whole bunch of different processes, a whole bunch of different colors, yellow, orange, red, magenta, and blue, and all sorts of different levels as well. Again, whilst it's not in its own right a method that sticks around a lot of the things that we do can be learned from here, and it's still a worthwhile thing to go and take a look at. Another one that was very popular in the early parts was DSDM, Dynamic Systems Development Method. It's evolved to something called Agile PM these days, although it comes from the same heart. Again, a lot of things we often take for granted in Agile training come from here. For example, if any of you have used Moscow for prioritization, must have, should have, could have, won't have yet, was popularized in DSDM. Even the whole idea of having a process, sort of the discovery, delivery type phase approach, came from DSDM. It also took a bunch of things seriously, like testing and making sure that actually we took the customer's view, the importance on stakeholders, and essentially the whole thing around delivering value. DSDM brought a lot of that, and you can see a lot of DSDM even written in the manifesto. The problem was at the time it was very heavyweight. You actually had to buy in to get into the process. It's relatively uncommon outside of Europe and can be a little vague in places. But still worthwhile looking at. As I said, it's evolved now to Agile PM, so all the DSDM content is actually freely available. Agile PM you can still get to, and they still offer certifications around that. Next one is EVO, Evolutionary Project Management. This is one of the things after the first time I delivered this that I got lots of email from people saying, why didn't you include this, including from the founder himself, Tom Gilb. This is essentially probably the original Agile method because it dates all the way back to the 1960s. But that whole idea of a plan, do, study, act type loop, decomposing work, doing the high risk stuff first, looking at your stakeholders, doing things in small iterations, was all sort of written about by Tom back in the 60s and 70s. But I guess the issue with this was that it was before its time, for one. But secondly, there's not a lot of resources apart from the book out there. But a lot of newer methods are built on what's in there. But if you want to go back and look at some of the, the early thoughts on it, great place to go look. And then we have RAD and ASD, Rapid Application Development, Adaptive Software Development. RAD comes from James Martin in 1991. Jim Highsmith kind of built on it with Adaptive Software Development in 1992. Again, this is really where the idea of the loop came from, of build, measure, learn, and discovery and delivery and release. RAD was very much built on really high quality, high speed, sit with the user, develop things. Adaptive Software Development focused on building the iterations. Interestingly, RAD was very successful here in Australia. It's probably the biggest market that they had. I know when I first started doing software development in the late 90s, I was doing RAD. So it was very popular here. Nowadays, it's almost dead. But a lot of the things that were learnt in there have built into other approaches. But yeah, it's a good one to go look at if you sort of want to understand the history of how we build things quickly. So when we talk about Agile, it'd be remiss not to talk about Lean. The Lean folks often, get upset when I sort of talk about Lean being an Agile method, and the Agile folks tend to get annoyed with me when I say it's also in the other way around. But the reality is that our history and things all point to Lean, and really you have to go back to the whole Lean process. And whether you call that Lean manufacturing, Lean enterprise, or the Toyota production system, we can actually go all the way back to the 1850s for this with the work of Eli Whitney. But it was really Tycho Ono and Toyota in the 1930s that where they built the Toyota production system that brought this to fruition. And James Womack really brought it to the rest of us in 1990 with his book, The Machine That Changed the World, where we really learned about the secrets of what was happening in manufacturing in Japan. So our Lean principles, which are up there on the top left-hand corner, things around improvement, the whole house of Lean, all of these things are built on it. The thing is, though, that this was really based around manufacturing, and whenever you read about anything about this, it is to do with manufacturing. And so sometimes we look at it and go, how does this apply to IT and business? So it can be sometimes difficult to adapt, but there's so many different things we can learn from there. And so to help with us, we have things like the theory of constraints, which Eli Goldratt wrote in his best-selling book, The Goal, in 1984. The thing about The Goal is it's not a textbook; it's a story. If anyone's read the Phoenix Project, it's the original Phoenix Project. That's where that idea was based upon. And this is where again we find things like the whole idea of theory of constraints and looking for those bottlenecks inside the process. In fact, there is many methods and models if you sort of read through this book, then I think even things that actually we haven't even unlocked. There's still a lot of gold in this book that we haven't even unlocked. But the whole process about looking for the constraints in the system comes out of Goldratt's work. We did talk before, though, that the problem was that how do we apply this to knowledge work? And so Lean software development is the work of Mary and Tom Poppendieck. In 2003, they wrote a number of books about this. There's 3 books in the series, but they took Lean from their knowledge of working at organizations like 3M and then applied it to knowledge work and software development. And so this is really where we started to apply more of those Lean techniques and could really understand what they actually meant. And well worth taking a look at their stuff or their works. They retired over COVID, but a lot of their stuff still lives on. Then we have the flow system, which is probably a more modern version of Lean. This came out a few years ago from 3 ex-Toyota folks, Nigel Thurlow, John Turner, and Brian Riviera. It talks about really this triple helix of flow. Not a lot of rocket science, and there's things that we've always been talking about, I think, like complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science. They've sort of reorganized the house of Lean, as you can see there, based on those 3 pillars, based on the Toyota way at the bottom and the customer at the top. And as I said, this triple helix flow really built this to sort of recognize Lean and bring it into the into the 21st century. The guide itself you can download for free. It's reasonably basic. If you want to get deeper, they have a whole bunch of different certifications and assessments. So again, you sort of have to pay to get into there, but there's a bunch of interesting stuff in there if you're interested in taking a look. It wouldn't be a good Agile talk if you didn't talk about Deming and his system of profound knowledge at number 8. Goes all the way back to 1939. And this whole idea of systems thinking, like being able to stand at the top of the factory and see what's going on, is what Deming talked about. The plan, do, study, act, or plan, do, check, act type loop is also Deming's work. if you look at his 14 points from Out of the Crisis, what you'll see is there's very agile related terms in here. Things like, make sure that we understand our purpose, make sure we build in quality, make sure that, we do continuous learning. The words are a little antiquated, drive out fear and eliminate slogans. But actually, if you sort of read through those, they're nothing different to even what we're struggling with right now in 2024. And the good news about this book is it's now so old. It's basically available freely because it's in public domain. Like anything, it requires an organizational change for you to really follow the works of Deming. Again, a lot of things are built on top of that. Well worth a read, though. Again, I don't think we've unlocked the value that's inside there. So the more modern version of this is Product Development Flow. This is the work of Don Reinerson. Back in 2009, the irony is the book has a waterfall on the cover of it. But he's the guy that started talking about, essentially what we now know as WSJF, but doing the highest delay cost job first, optimal batch size. The book is filled with 175 principles about why Agile and Lean works. Yes, 175. It is a tough book to read through. I had the pleasure of meeting Don a few years ago. And one of the questions I asked him, as I said, Don, I love your book, but it's a hard read. And his answer to me was, Craig, my book is like fine cheese. You can only take it in small doses. So this is not the book that you're going to read from cover to cover, but it is the book you want on your bookshelf, because if you're trying to get people to understand things that are in the top right-hand corner there, like why batch size is important, why work in progress constraints are important, why fast feedback is important. He has it laid out in a way that scientifically makes sense. So well worth taking a look at. Of course, if we think about Lean, what's made it a little more accessible to folks is Kanban. Kanban itself dates back to 2010. David J. Anderson. Now the Kanban University has really taken over this work, based around 4 principles. The board is part of it. We often, when we think about Kanban, people think about the board, but it's actually itself the principles, which is essentially start where you are, make sure you continually change, respect the process, and leadership is at all levels. And the properties are visualize the workflow, which is what the Kanban board is. But the other 4 is limit work in progress, manage your flow, make your policies explicit, and look for improvement. So it's very simple and easy, but it takes a lot of discipline in order to do, and as I said, is often misunderstood. And the community's been a little fractured over the years, both with the Scrum community as well within itself. But as an idea, it still holds a lot of weight. We also have personal Kanban, which is related to that, which is Jim Benson and Tian Demary Barry. From 2011, in fact, Jim and David were kind of working together. Jim sort of went down the more personal route. It's the same as Kanban. It's just Kanban for one, which 2 rules: visualize your work and limit your work in progress. So really, it's your to-do list. Using Kanban. Again, worth a look. As agilists, there's a lot of things we can do there just to practice our own ways of working. And then we have the Lean Startup, which dates back to 2008. This is the work of Eric Ries, although you can actually bring this back even further if you look at the work of Steve Blank. The reason this book, however, was important was it was the first book to ever on Agile or project management to actually make it on the New York Times bestseller list. We hadn't really had that exposure before. So lots of everyday people were trying to be entrepreneurs and were now starting to learn about different project management techniques as well as agility. So again, terms like minimal viable product, continuous deployment, pivot, all of those things come back to the Lean Startup and its build, measure, learn loop. I guess the interesting thing about this is that Agile was assumed at the core. Now, this was back in 2008. So they already assumed that you had to be doing Agile to take advantage of this. And a lot of organizations, again, tried to implement this, but hadn't really built out their Agile core. There are some downsides to it. There is a bit of hype around it. There is, if you really look into the science of it, people sort of say, hey, this is more about features than products. Again, you can make your own mind up, but again, well worth a look. All right, let's take a look at some of the extending methods. These are the things that have just made things a little more accessible. And there's a bunch of those that have just, I guess, made things a little newer or made things more accessible. So we can look at things like Modern Agile from Joshua Kirievsky, who boils it just down to 4 points. Make people awesome, deliver value continuously, experiment, learn rapidly, make safety a prerequisite. The safety thing is probably the thing that doesn't come out clear in the manifesto right now, and we're talking about psychological safety particularly there. Having spoken to a number of authors over the years, it's something they wish that they had it built in. Alistair Coburn was also concerned about where Agile was going, and again, this is 9 years ago, and tried to just boil it down the heart of Agile to 4 words, which are collaborate, deliver, reflect, and improve. Sam Zawadi, who was originally out of the UK but now based in Australia, popularized this idea of agnostic Agile, which is really look at different frameworks. And even here at SoftEd, we've tried to simplify the way the life cycle looks, and sort of boiling it down to sort of these 4 different things, but really realizing that it's not linear; it's actually continually spinning. And then we have a bunch of, I guess, hybrid methods, and I call them hybrid methods because, honestly, these are just people shoving things together and making a method out of it. For example, when you get Scrum and Kanban together, you get Scrumban, Coriolanus, or you take XP, Kanban, and Scrum, and you end up with Zanpan. Even Safe actually used to have Scrum XP. They renamed it to Safe Scrum in the most recent update to Safe 6, but they have their own version of it. Of course, when you don't do it so well, you end up with Water Scrumfall, which was popularized by Dave West in 2011. That's when you have Scrum in the middle, but the waterfall process is around the outside. Many large organizations still suffer from that. And then more recently, Judah Eckstein and John Buck came up with this idea of the Bossa Nova, which takes essentially your approach to budgeting, so using beyond budgeting, sociocracy for the way that you design your teams and organization, open space for the way you communicate, and agility, and pushes those things together. All worth a look. Then we have Scrumplop. I'll let you figure out why Kenny is on the page. If folks remember the movie Kenny, but Scrumplop plop stands for Pattern Languages of Programs. This is some work that Jeff Sutherland and Jim Coppeline started in 2010, which essentially makes a whole pattern language of Scrum, particularly Scrum. So if you're sort of looking for how does it actually work, because the Scrum Guide doesn't really dig into that. They started making patterns. If you're aware of patterns from programming, we have patterns for these processes as well. And this has continually been contributed to. It went a little dead across COVID, although it is still kicking along. They were sort of annually reviewing it, but they continue to look for those submissions to the patterns to fill them out. It's an interesting website just to go take a look at, and to just see how they actually map those patterns out as a good starting point. Well, there was then this idea that Agile wasn't enough, so we could make Agile 2. This came out in 2020. 15 different authors came up with 6 values and then 43 principles. I don't know why they came up with 43. 42 would have been a much better number for those who know about life, the universe, and everything. So I think they missed a trick in that. But 43 principles, which is kind of a lot of principles, to be honest with you. But they tried to look at a fresh look at what Agile means in the more modern world. Really sort of added leadership into there, which doesn't really focus in the manifesto at all. There's not a lot of guidance here. There's the book, there's the website. I haven't seen a lot of adoption for it, but again, there's some interesting ideas in here, and it is worth taking a look to see what you think. We then took Agile to the world, into manufacturing. Started with something called WikiSpeed and this car that was built in an Agile way. This work by Joe Justice has now moved into areas like Tesla. This is essentially using the basics of Agile and Scrum and working in iterations, but then applying it to technology. And in the early days, organizations like John Deere building tractors and actually sort of took these and were kind of interested in it because there was some things that Lean wasn't doing it for them. If you now look at the work at Tesla, building innovation, putting those technology practices back into manufacturing, and the whole idea that everybody is part of the manufacturing line, including Elon. Very interesting if you sort of look at what Joe talks about there. It's not very well documented though. It's not as if there's a book you can pick up. It's mostly videos and talks. It's very hard for organizations that aren't built in the same way like Tesla to change their factory configurations the same. But again, it is interesting, particularly if you have a manufacturing side or interested about how you apply this in different ways. All right, everyone's still with me. Let me move on to scaling methods now. We're up to number 17. So scaling methods. Obviously, the granddaddy of them all, the most popular is SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework. up to say 6 now in the framework. Originally sort of come from the work of Dean Leffingwell in 2007. He actually wrote about this originally in his book Scaling Software Agility, although interestingly that book was actually more about software requirements and scaling. He then followed it up with a book called Agile Software Requirements, which was more about scaling than software requirements. Go figure. I have spoken to Dean, and what's interesting, I guess, about SAFe is it really just started with him documenting some of the things he'd learned on a bunch of his gigs, and sort of now it's turned into this. It is the most popular scaling method. It's at 26%. Interestingly, that number has dropped year on year. So the uptake is going backwards. There's nothing really taking its place, by the way. It's become very popular because of its big picture. It's almost like Agile in a box. And for the most part, it does give organizations a great place to start. And if you talk to the really good SAFe people, that's what they say. It's not about just applying this as it's stated, but it's about using this as a starting point. It makes it theoretically a lot easier to put into organizations. The problem is that hasn't really occurred. If you actually go and there's a lot of community criticism. There's websites that are set up that talk about how it doesn't work so well. They took an NPS score a couple of years ago, and its NPS score for SAFe was at -56 apparently. So there is criticism out there. It does rely on its history. Dean Leffingwell was part of the RUP community, if anyone's old enough to remember that, and it is a bit certification heavy, but it has a lot of following, particularly in large organizations and government, and at its heart, there's nothing too wrong with it. It is built upon the things from the community. The criticism is about how it all falls together and if it is indeed the right setup. We then have Disciplined Agile, or DAD, not an American dad, but DAD is in Disciplined Agile Delivery. Scott Ambler originally proposed this in 2012. More recently, it got bought by the PMI, probably 5 or 6 years ago now. Interestingly, both Scott and Al have left the PMI. Still being integrated, still looks kind of the same as it does. You can see the toolkit on the left-hand side there. Al Shalloway brought DA Flex, which is more the value stream part of it. So the two things together are essentially now what the PMI's version is. One of the things I always liked about Disciplined Agile was that sometimes went in places that other methods didn't. It really talked a lot about governance and architecture and enterprise IT that the others don't really talk about in depth. But like other scaling methods, it is very heavyweight. It doesn't have a huge market adoption. As I said, the PMI still haven't figured out exactly what to do with it. So at the other end of the scale, there's large-scale Scrum or less. This originally was just the work of Craig Larman and Baz Vod. Really started in 2008. They released 2 books on scaling. And again, for those who've been around for a long time, in the sort of the late 2000s, these were the only things we had on scaling. These 2 books were kind of like our Bible. I have at least one of them sitting on the bookshelf behind me. And that was it. And they sort of took those books, realized that people were looking something a little more. And so they came along with less. And a few years later, they backed it up with the book on it as well. Less as a framework is reasonably lightweight. It's backed up by a few principles. It's up to 8 teams. If you want to go bigger than that, then they have what I think is ridiculously named Less Huge for up to a few thousand people. It has some interesting ideas inside there. For example, product owners are often a thing that people struggle with, when trying to implement this. So its ideas around that are pretty interesting. They've added some more guidance. It used to be just case studies. They've added more guidance over the years, which is good. The principles came along. A small adoption continues to grow a little bit, but because there's no clear process, it can be a little difficult to implement. But if you are based around Scrum, it is a good place to go start. One of the things that people have been talking about for over 10 years now is this idea of Spotify. You could also call it squatification, but often people call it the Spotify model. It's not a model. First thing Henrik Nyberg will tell you is that it was something that worked well for Spotify in 2012 when he documented it. They don't do anything like this now, but somehow people thought it was a model. It was just a way of working that they shared with the world. But nonetheless, there's still things we can learn from that. How to apply a matrix model. The engineering culture is really good. How they distribute is also really good, and they came up with some good tools. PDF video is still available there. But as I said, it's not a framework. It was just sharing experiences. And interesting, the work of Henrik is now continuing to evolve with, now some interesting ideas around AI as well. We then have Scrum at Scale. So this is Jeff Sutherland's. If we think about the 2 founders of Scrum, this is Jeff's version, 2014. interesting framework. It's based around, again, this sort of 3 to 9 team type level, with what he calls minimum viable bureaucracy, or MVB, just because you need another MV term in your life. The whole idea of Scrum of Scrums was sort of built out of here, things that we've been talking about for a while. What I like about this is that it kind of looks at it both from the product side and the delivery side. So it has the someone who looks after the Scrum of Scrums, also has an executive action team, or badly named as an EAT, and then a Meta Scrum team that looks after essentially the product side, or an EMT, which sounds like a medical facility to me, but nonetheless. Some interesting things in here. It is really hard to implement as designed, I think. Like, you'd need a whole organizational redesign and buy-in to do it. But some interesting ideas in there, particularly about how you sort of scale and make sure you make decisions at a higher level. The flip side to that is Nexus, which was Ken Schwaber's version of this. His framework is, if you look there, is very familiar because it is essentially Scrum. And if you look along the diagram, all he did was add the word Nexus to the front of everything. So you have Nexus Sprint Planning, Nexus Sprint Backlog, Nexus Daily Scrum, Nexus Sprint Review, Nexus Sprint Retrospective. So it didn't try terribly hard. It is, again, it's available freely in the Nexus guide, as was the Scrum at Scale guide, by the way, also in a book. Again, 3 to 9 teams, but is essentially really lightweight. So if you're after something just lightweight to get a small number of teams together, actually really good. Scrum at Scale when you want to go a little deeper, then move into the other ones if you want to go deeper again. But not a lot of usage. It's one I haven't really seen people use by name, but again, not a bad place to start if you're just trying to get a couple of teams working together. Probably the one that's gaining the most attention in the community right now is Fast Fluid Scale Technology. Dates back to 2015 from Ron Caudle. The Fast guide was only updated, I want to say weeks or maybe a couple of months ago. I can't remember. But my biggest criticism on this was that there was no model, but no diagram to follow. They actually have that now up in the top right corner. They've got principles, values, and pillars. If you look at the pillars, for example, it's based on things like open space and lean startup and organization structures. It is very much using a lot of more modern concepts like dynamic reteaming. The interesting thing about this is based around one meeting, so one event, which is what's called the fast meeting. So you kind of do all the things in one space. So it's truly trying to make things a lot simpler and built around those modern approaches. It's got low adoption, but interest is growing. It's one I see the most chatter about. But if you thought other approaches needed discipline, this one requires a lot of discipline, particularly if you're going to build it around one meeting. But an interesting one to go and at least take a look at and be more aware of. All right, let's switch gears, talk a little bit about technical methods. These are the things that just help us in, particularly for delivering software. So it'd be remiss not to talk about DevOps, and now it's sort of build on that DevSecOps, more recently AIOps. This whole idea of this loop of joining together development operation. Of course, then that included security, and now, of course, everyone's talking about AI. So how do we build AI into the process as well? The whole idea is really, if you think about the water scrum fall that I mentioned earlier, this is a thing that fixes the scrum fall part of it. Is how do we get things into the hands of customers, faster and better time to market. The thing about DevOps is it's not really owned by anybody. There's no definitive source. Dates back to Patrick Dubois in 2009. Probably the work of Gene Kim and others around the DevOps handbook is probably the closest you get to a kind of a Bible for this. And the biggest thing that we've been saying since 2009 is that it's not a role, it's not a department, it's not a tool set, right? It is a culture. Yes, there is tooling available. Yes, people support it, but it's the way of working. It's nothing more than that. Another interesting one is this idea called programmer anarchy or chaos development. This was popularized by Fred George in 2010. He originally called it programmer anarchy. In more recent years, he's referred to it as chaos development. This is the idea where actually, you move from agility to just the things that make sense. In fact, delete the things that don't make sense. And so in this, he talks about, well, you don't need stand-ups, you don't need stories, you don't need retrospectives, you don't need iterations, you don't need tests, you don't need continuous integration. You don't need any of those things. And you might look at that and go, well, what are we going to do? The idea is that essentially if people know what they're doing, they just get on and get stuff done and get it into the hands of the customer. But it does require a very clear focus, and so it works very well in the right culture and the right environment. And so Fred talks about the experience he had at a number of organizations in London where it worked really well. In fact, he says you don't even need any managers, which Depending on whether you sit here, you'll either go hooray or boo, depending on the role that you have. It's an interesting thing to go look at, though. It's not for everybody, but I think the process of how they got there is the important thing, and may work in your organization. There's not a lot of reference material. There is a short paper and a bunch of conference talks and videos, but again, well worth a look. There are lots of methods that support development, but one I did want to point out here is the Mikado method. This is essentially a method for refactoring, and this applies to lots of things in the technical space, is that there is actually a method behind the practice. And so one of the problems that sometimes occurs when you work with development teams is you can get stuck in this refactoring loop for days, weeks, months. So the Mikado method, it's based on that old children's game Pick Up Sticks, which is that kind of thing up in the left-hand corner. You've never played that as a kid. You kind of got to move one stick without moving the others. Kind of like a very ancient Jenga, I guess, to a certain extent. But the idea is that, if you do move something, you've got to be careful not to move all the other things. And so there's a whole process built around this for dealing with technical debt and refactoring. It is obviously developer focused, but again, if you've got developers, you're a developer yourself and unaware of this, if you're doing lots of refactoring, which you probably are, it's well worth taking a look at. We talked about XP before, talked about pair programming. Taking that to the extreme, we have mob programming, or it's sort of been morphed into ensemble programming as a name because people don't like the word mob. But the idea of mob programming or ensemble programming is not two people working at the same machine, it's the entire team working at the same machine. And so the idea is that the only way that things can get into the system is through the person driving the system at the time, and everybody else is essentially reviewing and adding value. Now, you might look at this and go, wow, I can't even get pair programming across the line. How would I get this across the line? But actually, there's a lot of studies that show that this actually is a continuous improvement mechanism and actually results in better quality. The interesting thing is when you talk to Woody, who came up with this in 2012, I remember talking to him very early on. I think it was one of his early talks for this. He said he'd have you convinced after 39 minutes this was the thing to do. And then the 40th minute, he said, don't do this. And his point was that the reason he said don't do it is this was something that he learned from the organization he was working at the time that actually solved a problem. And really the important thing here is that actually looking at your process and improving it is important. But what's happened in more recent years is that organizations have sort of looked at this and went, actually, this is not a bad idea, particularly if we're trying to solve a problem, and it's just taken off in its own right as a process. But well worth a look at, just to kind of see. And it may not be something you do all the time, but it may be something that solves a particular problem that you might have. We then have testing, all the DDDs, TDD, ATD, BDD, SBE. This goes back to 1994 and Kent Beck and test-driven development. Dan North sort of brought it to, the whole idea of BDD or behavior-driven development. Gojko Adzik then moved it again to specification by example, and BDD sort of came out of that as well. Test-driven development, which says, don't do anything until you've got a failing test and then just pass it. Or BDD says, or acceptance-driven development says, essentially, with your story, make sure you understand the failing test and then do the bare minimum to pass it. So again, we've learned sort of, from 1994 through to more recent times about, how to take these things and apply them in the large. And it's something that a lot of organizations do. And specification by example, I think, is one of the books that sort of, changed our industry a lot. And if you haven't read it, well worth taking a look. And then even the testers were in on this since the early days, contracts-driven testing. Many of the greats from testing, including James Bark and Kem Kaner, Brian Marek, who was one of the Agile Manifesto signeries. Back in 2001, we're talking about how do we deal with testing. It's one of the reasons why he was there as this method. And so context-driven testing is, if you actually read through the principles, is very much just what we understand Agile testing to be right now. It's still a school of thought that still exists, although not a lot has really happened to it. But the important thing out of this is that testing is not a process, it's actually a skill set. So again, well worth a look into that history, particularly if you're dealing with issues in testing. All right, let's take a look at business agility methods, particular business agility, which I'm not sure is the right name for this, to be perfectly honest with you, but look, Business Agility Institute is probably the leader in this. Evan Laybourne, Evan Laybourne, based out of Melbourne. He has the domains of business agility. In fact, they've just updated this diagram to look more like a square than a circle, but the stuff in there is the same. All the things inside that circle are things that you need to think about. The Agile Business Consortium, ABC, also have been thinking about similar things. They also have a framework for business agility. And people like Mick Kirsten have sort of come out with this flow framework about, just how we think about how we flow and think about moving from project to product. There's a lot of work about essentially how do we take agility and bring it up to the entire organization, because that's where the real gain is. It's not just, in one team. Of course, there's lots of sort of, different subsets of this. This is just one in the finance side. I mean, we could look at the same in HR and marketing. Again, but I'd have to make this 100 agile methods in 100 minutes. But I will mention beyond budgeting, because it is one that's been around for a while, started in 1998 by the book called Beyond Budgeting, probably more popularized in the agile community by Bjarne Bognes more recently than that. What's interesting about beyond budgeting is, what does modern budgeting look like? I know probably, some of your organizations are now starting to do things, in this space. What's interesting, I guess, in the principles that are listed there on the left is that only one of them has anything to do with money. The other, 11 of them have to do with management and trust. So you can sort of see all those principles there. That's the whole reason why we have budgeting, is it's kind of it's a sort of a trust control mechanism. Used widely in areas like oil and gas, but again, I'm seeing a lot more organizations start to sort of move towards this idea of things like progressive funding and other things. The other thing is this whole idea of design thinking and human-centered design. Again, we can take this back all the way back to the 1950s and Johnny Arnold. Started to get popularized more by David Kelly and Tim Brown at IDEO in 2005. And so again, many of you probably worked in the whole idea of the double diamond and sort of the 5-step process of design thinking. A lot of agile discovery is built around this. So this really sort of brought the customer first type angle to it, satisfying the customer. I guess one of the downsides to all this stuff, though, is that often people misunderstand it or haven't really gone and studied what design thinking really means. There is also an element of linear process. So in the 5-step process at the top, if you sort of look at the test part here, you almost need to draw a circle back to empathize, because every time you iterate, you're essentially going around the cycle. It's not terribly clear, even though that was the intent. Then we have lots of roles. So there are lots of role-based certifications. Some of you probably have some of these. So if you're a project manager, the PMI have, bought into agility. They have their ACP certification, and even the latest version of the PMBOK is now principle-based to bring it a lot closer to agility. Prince2 have had an agile practitioner for a number of years now. The business analysis community in the IRBA recognize this through agile analysis, but as well as product ownership and other things that are built into the BABOK and the BA standard. ISTQB from a testing perspective, and had agile tester for many years. And then you have organizations like IC Agile that have a whole bunch of the role-based certifications based around the ICP at its base, but things like testing and project management and technical processes and all those types of things. Then the management schools, again, there's a whole pile of these. I'll just point out Management 3.0 because that's probably the one that's closest to the Agile community. It's Jürgen Appello. The original book came out in 2011. The book's okay, but actually it's the workshops that I find to be a lot more valuable. So the workshop practices you can get from the website, but a lot of different techniques and practices just about how you can start to make where you're working a better place to work and be a facilitator as a leader. So you can see the principles up in the top right-hand corner. Some interesting stuff there. The schools of management are really evolving, particularly over the last few years. Even if you look at what the World Economic Forum is saying, the idea of power skills and all the rest of it really shows that those management skills and just those human skills are super important now, and what employers are looking for. And if you think about coaching and facilitation, there's a lot of tools here. Again, only scratching the surface here. Started by Lisa Aikens and Michael Spade in 2011 with the Agile Coach Competency Framework. That's evolved in more recent years to the Agile Coaching Growth Wheel, which got a little more detail. Some might say a little more complicated as well. Technical coaching and the Salmon Method by Emily Bash in 2021. So how technical coaches, whether that be things like testing or software development, about how you can sort of coach. It also talks about that ensemble working, and even the way we facilitate through things like liberating structures from 2013 that makes the way we facilitate really be more diverse and inclusive, particularly. That's why these liberating structures exist. And again, you've had good facilitators, you probably will be aware of most of those liberating structures, even if you haven't noticed what they are. Then we have all the organization transformational methods. So if you think of an organization level or a government, we can start to bring in things like Frederick Laloux and reinventing organizations, again, back to 2014, but this idea of moving more towards teal. If you think about agility, it's really in the green space, and even for a bunch of our organizations, moving from red to green has, been a journey. I'm not sure the idea is everybody has to get to teal, but there are parts of teal, if you sort of look in there, things like mindfulness and self-management, are all important. I don't think, teal is absolutely the goal, but elements of teal are probably the goal. And then we have government. I did some work a couple of years ago with Julian Smith in the ASPC about a government agility model, which you can see there. But most governments have the sort of a digital service standard. They came from gov.uk back in 2012. The Australian government, New Zealand government, Singapore government have all sort of have got versions of that they've adopted, which essentially include agile as part of the standard that government services must meet. If you're wondering about how you transform, a lot of things often sit with different consulting companies. They have their own methods, but if you're after one that's more publicly available, Agenda Shift is one to look at. Dates back to 2015, although Mike continues to tinker around with this. In fact, there are only updates just recently to this model. It kind of breaks it down to a bunch of strategies and patterns and activities that you can work through, but it's an open transformation framework. I'm not sure it's the thing you pick up and follow all the way through, but as a sort of a bit of a checklist or guidance, it's actually pretty good, and it works with any framework. So it doesn't matter whether you're working with a large scaling framework or your own type of version, it sort of gives you some guidance. So it's well worth a look. There's sort of some interesting approaches to transformation. Kind of dates back to open space technology, which is Harrison Owen in 1984, who really sort of talked about this whole idea of open space. And some of you may have experienced open space. It's the kind of thing up on the right-hand side there about just how you might be able to run or facilitate sessions where it's kind of agendaless, but allows people to pick the things that they want to talk about. That's evolved into a process called open space agility. Again, based back to 2015, Daniel Mezek. It's this idea that if you have an open space meeting within 100 days, you can essentially transform your organization. I've never seen this work in practice, and if anyone has been at work, I'd love to hear from you. Again, I'm a little dubious about the claims in here, but if you had the right environment, I guess it would work. But I think there's some things in there we can learn. We often waterfall our transformations, and so this is something at least give you some guidance about what you might want to get through, and I think would work pretty well in a small organization, but larger organizations, it's pretty disruptive, but interesting to take a look. Then we have holacracy and sociocracy. We're at 38. We're almost there, folks. Hang in there. So holacracy is 2006. Brian Robinson. Sociocracy has been around for generations now. But essentially, this is the flattening of the structure. And holacracy, if you go read it, it has a whole constitution. It's what we call an internal democracy. It's interesting. Zappos was, which was bought by Amazon a number of years ago, was kind of the poster child for this. Over time, it sort of faded away. If you read articles about it, depending who you talk to, people would say it was a complete success or a complete failure. But this flattening, which we're seeing a lot of organizations realizing they need to do in a structure, is interesting to go look at. So again, I'm not sure how successful you'd be in holacracy by the book, but there are lots of interesting things if you're trying to solve different problems that you might get from this. Of course, we're in a more hybrid world, so we have the Remote Agility Framework, or RAF. This made in Australia. You can see a bunch of the folks on the slide there. You may be aware of them or have worked with some of them. It's kind of this remote first type approach. Look, the thing is that in order to really get to the toolkits, you do need to go through the paywall. But the interesting thing is that they've designed this from the ground up around remote tool sets. And so whilst it's got a low adoption, there's some interesting things in there, but you're a little limited to what you can see before you have to get through the paywall. And then we have Cynefin. I'm sure many people on the call have heard of that, but the whole idea that essentially it's something that supports our way of thinking. This is Dave Snowden all the way back to 1999. Continues to just get more and more traction over the years. And I guess one of the big things that I always talk about here is that it's moving organizations from thinking all this stuff sits on this right-hand side of just simple and complicated. It's actually, we are in this VUCA world of complex and complicated, and in fact chaotic. But the problem with chaotic is that, while some of us thrive in there, we don't want to live in there. So how do we move it back into these other steps? It's a good way of making sense of problems and sense of situations. Can be hard to understand and apply. And if you watch Dave's videos, he is Welsh, so you've got to watch them about 3 times to understand them. But it is a well-regarded method and a good way of thinking and problem solving. Oh, that's 40. Wow, you made it. Give yourselves a round of applause. So here's a couple of just final thoughts I wanted to leave you with before we have a few moments left of questions. It'd be remiss of me not to, just say that we are going through a bit of a reimagining right now. There's lots of media about what is the state of Agile and all those type of things. But the reality is that nobody's saying we go back to waterfall. The thing is that we just have to reimagine and find the value a little bit. And so, what you might find in your own organizations is by, actually looking wider than what you have to find those problems that might be extremely useful. So as a community, how do we start to reimagine this? Because, whilst the name might be a little bit on the nose or may not be, it's not the shining star it once was, the reality is that it's not going away. It's just become part of what we do. It's crossed the chasm. And so what I want to leave you with is this thing called the Oath of Non-Allegiance. This is Alistair Coburn's work in 2010. Unfortunately, when he redesigned his website, he took the site down. He used to be able to sign it, but this is something I've always subscribed to in my sort of view of the world around Agile, because it's not about a framework, it's about what we do. And so I'm asking you all, just having sort of sat through this and listened to this, and what you might go and look at next is, don't exclude from consideration any idea based on its source, but consider ideas across schools and heritages in order to find the ones that best suit the current situation. In other words, there's 39 other things out there. Folks, that was 40 Agile methods in 40-ish kind of minutes. Thank you. Hope you got some value out of that. We'll make the slides available to you.
Cool. Thank you, Craig. That was very interesting. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the question and answer bit here. And we'll wait to see if anyone has any. I'd just like to throw one out first of all. You're talking about Scrum or Scrum but and so forth. There's very few teams that I encounter that are actually doing pure Scrum. So are we at the risk of moving away from pure implementations of any of these methods and just towards a more primordial soup of methods that people are just pretty much along the lines of that open non-allegiance? How widespread are you seeing that?
So that's kind of the point, is that, whilst many people start with it, even Scrum right, we could rename that to be Agile right, or safe or less or whatever it is, the method that you start with, is that, many people will go on a Scrum training course and, you can sit in that world. I worked with a team a few years ago who were implementing safe, and the only thing they knew was safe. If it wasn't on the safe website, they weren't even aware there was a world out there. So that's the point. If you read the manifesto, it doesn't talk anywhere about practices in there, right? Those principles give you guidance on how to do it. What we got here is 40 different things, and I see a question that sort of popped up in front of me from anonymous attendee. Are there too many methods? Is there one that should rule them all? I guess that's the point. Is that it's not about looking at all 40 of these. Like, none of you are going to have the time to go and look at 40 of them after this. But the reason I've sort of stacked them like this a little bit is that when you're back at work and you're sort of scratching your head and going, this thing we're doing is not right, you may find an answer in one of these 40 somewhere. So, there's sort of some starting points to go look, just to question and go, how might we solve this problem? Because the manifesto and its principles are what we're adhering to, not the adherence to any one particular method.
So is there a chance that we could end up really with the Cynefin framework as a superset of all of these, just then drawing in all of the practices from these other methods?
It doesn't necessarily need to be the Cynefin method. I mean, if that's a problem solving technique. It's not a technique for doing work, though. It doesn't give you any guidance on how to do the work. So again, Cynefin is part of your toolkit of things that solve problems.
Okay. So we've got a question there. What level of importance do you place on behaviors versus process in being successful with any way of working?
Yeah, thank you, Anonymous. Whatever your name is, call you Anonymous. I think if you look at the manifesto and its focus on values and principles, that's really what we're talking about here. Is it's behaviors. It's another word I like to use is discipline. It's the discipline of being able to do something different. Communicate better, all those type of things. And so those behaviors and how the team behaves is important. And so one of the biggest holes that people fall into is this, we have to follow this method, or, big organizations specifically put in big frameworks and say, this is our consistent way of working. The reality is that every individual, every team works slightly differently. And when you start to look at technologies like AI, that's going to even further compound the issue. So whilst large organizations do need some consistency in maybe, how you progress through the process, or, how you report, or how you communicate, actually how you do the work has to be very open, and that's behavioral. So you've got to start with what is the problem we're trying to solve, and what is the best way for us to solve this, rather than what is the process that we follow. That's particularly important in knowledge work, not so much in tactical work. Like if you're a bank teller, for example, yeah, you do need an SOP or a system of work, because Colin, if you're on the bank teller and you go for lunch, I can't come in and go, well, I might go and process loans differently now. There has to be some consistency, but that's more tactical, operational type work. We're talking here about knowledge work. However, even in those tactical things, the ability to be able to look at things and go, we can improve that, which is what lean is all about, is still equally important. So even in that operational work, the behaviors are important, but depending on the type of work you do will depend on the ability you have to, fully design that way of working.
Yeah, fair enough. The whole concept of SOPs, your standard operating procedures, just come into that whole technical area, isn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got another question from Ben here. Has it seen a team work as well distributed than co-located? Have you seen any exceptional distributed teams?
Yeah, distributed agile is an oxymoron. And hey, Ben, used to work with Ben many years ago, so thanks for coming, mate. Actually, I think one of the things that we forget is that even since the beginning of agility, and Ben and I, working back together, I won't drop Ben in the age, but in the age group, but I mentioned the early 2000s and the mid 2000s. That's how long I've known Ben for. Is that we've always had some amount of distributed work. It may not have been via Zoom or Teams that we do now, but we've had people in different cities and different countries and different time zones and things like that. And we used to base this premise, and I don't really know where it came from, that teams need to be co-located. Now that premise was based not about the co-location aspect. It was just that if we were all in the same office, it made it easier to communicate. So the reality is that when you start to work in a more distributed manner, it is how do we communicate? And I think, Ben, if I sort of read between the lines, is that when I look at what you call exceptional, I'm not sure exceptional is the right word, but when I look at teams that do this well, it's because they've licked how they communicate, and it's because they've got tools. And one of the problems is that Microsoft Teams on its own is not the only tool, right? We kind of introduced that and we said, yep, we can chat and we can share a whiteboard and we're done. But when you start to use tools like Miro or Mural, and you start to find better chat mechanisms, and you've got really good tools for technology, and things for checking in code, and for collaborating with others on whatever it is you're working on, and then you start to add AI into the mix, you actually find that teams can work really well distributed, but it has to start with a desire to work well in that way. Even just things like, hey, I'll turn my camera on occasionally just to have a face-to-face conversation with people. That's not something you can enforce. It's something that you have to build trust around. And so if you want to come right back to the start of how you get people working together in a distributed way, is that those working agreements or social contracts are super important. Super, super important. It's got to start there, but you also have to have the right tooling that supports your way of working in order to support that. So I've seen lots of really good distributed teams, Ben, but the secret sauce has been that there's a desire to work in that way. And then there's been these, just support in the tooling and the leadership teams for them to actually work in that way.
Cool, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions before we wrap up?
I think their brains just exploded. And
yeah, indeed. Well, that brings us pretty much to the end time. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, Craig, for what you've had to say. It's been very interesting.
we'll make sure that everyone gets access to the slides, because there's a lot of stuff in there, and there's links to everything. So, my ask is oath and allegiance, and go and explore.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.